The village slept under a sky so clear it felt like you could reach up and brush your fingers against the stars. But in one small corner of that quiet place, a single light still burned. It came from a tiny shop tucked between a bakery that had closed hours ago and a tailor's stall covered in a faded blue tarp. The shop had no sign, just a wooden bench outside, a few scattered leather scraps, and the faint, familiar smell of wax and old wood. Inside, a man sat hunched over a pair of boots, his hands moving slowly, carefully, like he was handling something far more precious than worn leather. He wasn't young anymore. His hair had gone mostly gray, and the lines around his eyes deepened every time he squinted in the dim light. But his fingers, those were still strong. Years of hammering nails, stitching soles, and rubbing polish into cracked grain had left them rough but steady. Every night, without fail, he stayed long after the sun had dipped behind the hills. Not because he had orders to fill or customers waiting. He stayed because it gave him something to do with his hands, and something to do with his thoughts. 6 months ago, his only son had left for military service. There had been no grand farewell, no crowd-waving flags, just a quiet morning, a packed duffel bag, and a handshake that lasted a second too long. Since then, the house had grown quieter, the meals smaller, the silences heavier. So the man filled those silences with work, and every evening, without telling anyone why, he'd take out a pair of boots, sometimes his own, sometimes an old pair left behind by a neighbor, and polish them until they shone like they'd never seen dust or rain. Tonight, it was a pair of army-issue boots. They weren't his son's, they were too big, but they were close enough. He'd gotten them from a farmer whose nephew had just finished his service. The boots were scuffed, the laces frayed, the heels uneven from months of marching. To anyone else, they'd be trash, but to him, they were worth the time. He dipped a rag into a tin of dark brown polish, the kind that smelled like pine and warmth, and began to rub. Back and forth, circular motions on the toe, extra care on the stitching. He didn't rush. There was no clock he needed to beat, no boss waiting. Just him, the boots, and the soft hum of a single bulb hanging from the ceiling. Outside, the wind picked up, rustling the dry leaves that had gathered near the shop's threshold. A stray cat darted past, eyes glowing in the dark. Somewhere down the lane, a door creaked shut. The man didn't look up. His world had shrunk to the grain of the leather beneath his fingers, the rhythm of his breath, and the quiet ache in his chest that never quite went away. He remembered the day his son left. The boy had stood in this very doorway, boots already laced tight, cap pulled low over his forehead. "Don't wait up," he'd said with a half-smile, trying to sound brave. But his voice cracked just slightly on the last word. The man had nodded, hands shoved deep in his pockets so his son wouldn't see them tremble. He hadn't said much, just, "Be careful, and write when you can." But inside, 1,000 other words had crowded his throat. "Come back safe. Don't forget to eat. Remember to change your socks in the rain." He'd swallowed them all. Now, as he worked the polish into the heel, he imagined his son somewhere far away. Maybe sitting on a cot in some dusty outpost, maybe polishing his own boots the same way, maybe thinking of home, maybe not. He didn't know. Letters came rarely, and when they did, they were short, just enough to say he was okay, that the food was bad, that the nights were cold. No details, no stories, just reassurance wrapped in silence. The man set the boots down for a moment and stretched his back, wincing at the familiar pop in his shoulder. He glanced out the window. The moon hung high now, casting silver shadows across the empty street. Most of the village had gone to bed hours ago. Even the dogs had stopped barking. Only the distant sound of a generator, somewhere near the mosque, broke the stillness. He sighed and reached for the tin again. One more pass, just to make sure. As he rubbed, his mind drifted to the old days, when his son was small and they'd sit together on this same bench watching the sunset. The boy would chatter about school, about the stray dog he wanted to keep, about how he'd fix the world one day. Back then, the future felt wide open, full of possibilities. Now it felt narrow, like a road winding through fog with no idea what waited around the next bend. He finished the right boot and picked up the left. The leather here was tougher, more stubborn. It took longer to bring out the shine. He didn't mind. Time didn't matter much at this hour. What mattered was the act itself, the care, the attention, the quiet promise in every stroke of the rag. It was his way of saying, "I'm still here. I'm still waiting." A moth fluttered against the window pane, drawn to the light. He watched it for a moment, then went back to work. The polish soaked in, turning dull brown into something rich and deep. He tied the laces neatly, the way his son always did. Double knot, no loops. Then he placed the boots side by side on the shelf, next to a dozen others he'd polished over the past months. None of them belonged to anyone in particular, but each one felt like a message sent into the dark, hoping someone would understand. He blew out the candle on the workbench, saving electricity, and turned off the bulb. The shop fell into shadow, but the moonlight spilled in through the cracks in the shutters, painting stripes across the floor. He locked the door, slipped the key into his pocket, and started the short walk home. His boots, old, comfortable, polished just that morning, clicked softly against the cobblestones. The house was dark when he got there. He didn't turn on the lights. He knew every step, every creak in the floorboard. In the kitchen, he poured himself a glass of water and stood by the window, looking out toward the eastern hills, the direction his son had gone. He didn't pray out loud, but he held the glass tightly and whispered a single sentence into the quiet. Just come back in one piece. Then he went to bed. Not because he was tired, but because tomorrow would come whether he slept or not. And when it did, he'd open the shop again, sweep the floor, boil tea, and wait. Maybe for a customer. Maybe for news. Maybe just for the chance to polish another pair of boots, because as long as his hands were busy, his heart didn't feel quite so empty. He didn't know it yet, but this would be the last night he'd spend alone in that silence. In 3 days, the ground would tremble with the sound of engines, and the road into town would fill with dust and strangers. But tonight there was only the wind, the stars, and the quiet hope carried in the shine of a well-polished boot. Dawn came soft that morning, the kind of light that creeps in like a secret, pale gold at first, then slowly washing the hills in warmth. The village stirred gently. A rooster crowed, a kettle whistled, an old man shuffled out to feed his goats. Everything felt normal, peaceful even. No one expected the day to tilt on its axis before breakfast. But then, just as the baker pulled his first tray of bread from the oven, the ground began to hum. At first it was faint, a low vibration beneath the feet like distant thunder that hadn't yet found its voice. Children playing near the well paused, heads cocked. Dogs lifted their ears. Then the sound grew. Not thunder, engines, many of them. Deep, rumbling, getting closer. People stepped out of their homes, squinting toward the eastern road, the same road that wound through the valley and disappeared into the mountains. Dust rose in the distance, a thick rolling cloud kicked up by tires moving fast. A military convoy. Not one or two trucks, but a whole line of them, stretching far back into the haze. That alone was strange. Convoys passed through sometimes, yes, but always with notice, always with purpose announced ahead of time. This one arrived like a storm no one had seen coming. Anxiety prickled through the square. Elders exchanged glances. Mothers called their children inside. Men stood a little straighter, arms crossed, eyes narrowed. In this part of the world, unexpected soldiers rarely brought good news. Too many stories lived in the bones of this village. Tales of knock on the door in the night, of sons who left and never returned, of silence that followed official letters. So when the lead truck slowed at the edge of town, brakes hissing like a tired breath, more than a few hearts pounded hard against ribs. The vehicle stopped right in the middle of the dusty square. For a long moment nothing happened. Then the passenger door swung open. A young soldier jumped down before the engine had fully quieted. He wore the standard uniform, but it hung on him differently. Looser, worn at the elbows, dust caked into the seams. His boots were scuffed beyond repair, and his face, though young, carried a kind of weariness that didn't belong on someone his age. He scanned the crowd quickly, eyes searching, urgent, and then he saw him. Across the square, standing in the doorway of his shop with a broom in hand, was the cobbler. The man froze. His broom slipped from his fingers and clattered against the stone step. He didn't move to pick it up. He just stared, because it was his son. But not the boy who'd left 6 months ago with a stiff cap and nervous smile. This young man stood taller, yes, but his shoulders were bowed under something heavier than a pack. His eyes, once bright with restless energy, now held a quiet depth, like he'd seen things he couldn't unsee. And yet, when their eyes met, something flickered in them. Relief, maybe, or just the simple joy of being home, even if only for a moment. The son didn't run. He walked fast, boots crunching on the gravel, until he stood just a few feet away. For a heartbeat, neither spoke. Then the young man did something unexpected. He didn't embrace his father. Instead, he turned and waved sharply toward the convoy. One by one, the other trucks rolled to a stop. Doors opened. Soldiers stepped out, not in formation, not with rigid posture, but slowly, wearily, like men who'd been walking for days without rest. There were 24 of them, maybe more, and every single one carried something wrapped in cloth tied with string or tucked carefully under an arm. The villagers watched, confused. No one spoke. The usual tension that came with soldiers was there, but mixed with something else: curiosity, bewilderment. This didn't feel like an inspection. It didn't feel like trouble. The son turned back to his father. "We need your help," he said, voice low but clear. Not a request. A plea. The cobbler blinked. What is this?" His son glanced at the men behind him, then back. "We were stationed near the border. There was a camp, refugees, mostly women and children. A flash flood hit in the night. We pulled people out for 2 days straight. Many lost everything, shoes, clothes. Some didn't make it." He swallowed hard. The ones who did, most were barefoot. Winter's coming. Their feet, they're raw. He paused, then added quietly, "I remembered your shop." The cobbler looked past his son at the soldiers. They weren't standing at attention. They were leaning against their trucks, rubbing their eyes, shifting weight from one foot to the other. And in their arms, bundles. Small bundles. Children's shoes. Torn sandals. Boots with holes. All salvaged. All brought here with care. One young soldier, barely older than a teenager, held a pair of tiny slippers, pink, soaked through, one missing a button. He caught the cobbler's gaze and gave a small, almost shy nod. The father didn't say anything for a long time. He just looked at his son, really looked. Saw the mud still under his nails, the dark circles beneath his eyes, the way his hands trembled slightly, not from fear but from exhaustion. And in that moment he understood. This wasn't a military stop. This was a mission of mercy, and his son had risked something, maybe his standing, maybe his safety, to bring these men here. Finally, the cobbler nodded. He bent down, picked up his broom, and leaned it against the wall. Then he walked to his shop door, unlocked it, and stepped inside. He didn't invite them in. He didn't have to. One by one, the soldiers followed. Inside the shop was small, shelves lined with tins of polish, coils of thread, stacks of soles in every size. The air smelled of leather and beeswax. The cobbler moved to the center of the room and turned to face them. "Show me what you have," he said simply. They laid the bundles on his workbench. The cloth unwrapped to reveal a heartbreaking collection. A child's sandal held together by twine, a woman's slipper with the heel torn off, army boots too big for the small feet they'd been given to. Some were beyond repair, but many could be saved with time, with care, with hands that knew how to listen to leather. The son stood near the door, watching his father. He hadn't come home for rest. He'd come for help. And now he waited to see if the village would answer. Outside, the villagers had gathered closer. They'd seen the bundles. They'd heard the hushed words. And slowly, quietly, they began to understand. An old woman in a faded headscarf stepped forward first. "I have shoes," she said. "My grandson outgrew them last spring. They're still good." A boy ran off toward his house and came back with a pair of sturdy boots his older brother had left behind. A shopkeeper brought a box of spare sandals from his storeroom. Within minutes, the cobbler's small shop was no longer just his. It had become a place of gathering, of quiet giving. The soldiers stood back, stunned. They hadn't expected this. They'd braced for suspicion, maybe even refusal. Instead, they were met with open hands. The cobbler looked at his son again. This time he placed a hand on his shoulder, brief, firm, full of everything he couldn't say out loud. Then he turned to the workbench, picked up a needle and thread, and got to work. Outside, the sun climbed higher. The convoy sat silent in the square, no longer a threat but a bridge. And in that small shop, surrounded by strangers who were quickly becoming something more, the real work began, not of war, but of healing. One stitch, one sole, one pair of boots at a time. The work began quietly, almost shyly, like people weren't sure how much they were allowed to give. But once the first needle pierced leather, something shifted. It wasn't just about fixing shoes anymore. It was about stitching together pieces of hope, one careful thread at a time. Inside the cobbler's shop, the air grew thick with the smell of warm wax, damp wool, and the faint metallic tang of needles. The soldiers stood back at first, unsure whether to help or stay out of the way. But the villagers didn't wait for permission. They simply rolled up their sleeves and got to work. An elderly woman with hands like twisted roots sorted through the pile of donated footwear, muttering to herself as she matched sizes. A teenage boy sharpened a dull awl on a stone, his brow furrowed in concentration. Two girls, no older than 10, sat cross-legged on the floor, threading laces through eyelets with surprising patience. The cobbler moved among them like a quiet conductor. He didn't give orders. He just showed how to reinforce a torn heel, how to soften stiff leather with a bit of oil, how to patch a sole without making it lumpy. His son watched from the corner, leaning against a shelf, exhaustion finally catching up to him. He hadn't slept properly in days, but he refused to sit. Not yet. One of the soldiers, a tall man with a scar across his eyebrow, stepped forward hesitantly. "Can I help with something?" he asked, voice rough but polite. The cobbler nodded toward a stack of boots with broken stitching. "Start here," he said. "Use the waxed thread. Pull tight but not so tight it rips." The soldier sat on a low stool and began, his large fingers fumbling at first. But soon his movements grew steadier. Beside him a village boy watched, then mimicked his motions on a smaller pair. No one spoke much. Words weren't needed. The rhythm of needle and thread, the soft scrape of sandpaper, the occasional sigh, it all said enough. Outside, the news had spread. More people arrived, not with questions, but with offerings. A woman brought a basket of socks she'd knitted over the winter, thick woolen, dyed in soft blues and browns. "They're not fancy," she said, placing them gently on the bench, "but they'll keep feet warm." Another carried a sack of old blankets, cut into squares for insoles. Even the schoolteacher came, arms full of children's drawings, bright, cheerful sketches of suns and flowers and smiling faces. "For the kids in the camp," she explained, "so they know someone's thinking of them." By midday, the cobbler's shop had spilled into the street. Makeshift tables appeared. Old doors balanced on crates, benches dragged from courtyards. Neighbors brought tea in chipped pots and shared bread wrapped in cloth. Someone lit a small fire in a metal drum to keep hands warm. It wasn't organized. It wasn't planned. It just happened, like a river finding its course after a long drought. The son finally sat down, slumping onto an upturned bucket near the doorway. His father brought him a cup of tea, no sugar, just the way he liked it. They sat in silence for a while, watching the scene unfold. People laughed softly as they worked. A baby cried in the distance, then quieted. The sun moved across the sky, casting long shadows that danced over piles of shoes. "You didn't have to do this," the father said at last, voice low. His son looked at him, eyes tired but clear. "I couldn't not do it," he replied. "You should have seen them, Baba. The children. They were walking on stones, on ice, with nothing but rags tied around their feet. One little girl, she couldn't be more than 5, she held my hand and asked if her shoes would grow back." The father's throat tightened. He looked away, pretending to inspect a loose heel on a boot in his lap. But his hand stilled for a moment. "They won't forget this," the son added softly. "Not the people in the camp. And not us either." As afternoon turned to evening, the pace didn't slow. If anything, it grew more urgent. Winter wasn't just coming, it was already knocking. Every pair finished meant one less person shivering through the night. The soldiers, who had arrived as strangers, now worked side by side with villagers, their uniforms blending into the crowd. One young soldier taught a group of boys how to tie a secure knot. Another helped an old man sand down a sole so it wouldn't blister small feet. Inside the shop, the cobbler paused to stretch his back. His fingers ached, his eyes burned, but he felt something he hadn't in months: purpose. Not the quiet, lonely kind he'd carried while polishing boots alone at night. This was different. This was shared. This was alive. At one point, he noticed his son had fallen asleep upright against a sack of leather scraps, head tilted back, mouth slightly open. At his feet, neatly lined up like soldiers at rest, were 6 pairs of repaired boots. Small sizes, clearly meant for children. The father smiled faintly. He grabbed a thin blanket from the pile and draped it over his son's shoulders without waking him. Night fell gently. Lanterns were lit. The fire in the drum crackled. People worked by lamplight now, faces glowing in the soft amber. No one talked about going home. No one mentioned stopping. They just kept going, stitching, patching, polishing, folding. And in that quiet hum of shared effort, something unspoken passed between them all. This wasn't charity. It was kinship. The kind that doesn't ask where you're from or what you've lost. The kind that sees cold feet and says, "Here, let me help." Hours later, when the last stitch was tied and the final boot set aside, the cobbler looked around at the faces, tired, smudged with soot and wax, but calm. The soldiers stood in a loose circle, their arms full of parcels wrapped in clean cloth. Each one held a pair of shoes, a pair of socks, sometimes a small drawing tucked inside. The sun was awake now, standing tall again, though his eyes still held that deep weariness. He walked to his father and placed a hand on his shoulder, just as his father had done for him earlier. "We'll take good care of them," he said. The cobbler nodded. He didn't say be safe or come back soon. He just pressed a small tin of polish into his son's palm. "For the road," he murmured. And in that simple gesture everything was said. The night didn't bring rest. Not this time. As soon as the last parcel was wrapped and the final knot tied, the real work began, not with tools but with time. The villagers didn't go home. They stayed. Some brought extra blankets and laid them over benches. Others stoked the fire in the metal drum until it glowed orange against the dark. A few women returned with pots of soup, simmered slowly over their own stoves, now shared without a word. Inside the cobbler's shop, the air grew thick with warmth and the quiet hum of people refusing to sleep. Candles flickered on every surface, on shelves, on windowsills, balanced on upturned tins. Their light danced across faces bent over leather and thread, casting long, gentle shadows that moved like silent companions. No one spoke much. There was no need. The work itself was the conversation. The cobbler sat at his bench, hands moving almost without thought. He'd done this 1,000 times before, replacing soles, mending tears, softening stiff edges. But never like this. Never with so many eyes watching, so many hands reaching out to help, so many hearts quietly beating in the same rhythm. Every stitch felt heavier, like it carried more than thread. It carried care. It carried a promise. His son worked beside him, though exhaustion pulled at his shoulders like a weight. He kept dozing off for a few seconds at a time, head dipping forward only to jerk awake and reach for another pair of shoes. Once the cobbler caught him staring at a tiny sandal, pink with a chipped bead on the strap, and his eyes went distant like he was seeing something far away. The father didn't ask. He just handed him a fresh needle and kept working. Outside, the village had transformed. What had started as a single man's quiet ritual had become a gathering of hands and hearts. Teenagers took turns sharpening tools. Grandmothers hummed old songs as they folded socks into neat bundles. Even the youngest children helped, sorting laces by length, wiping polish off finished boots with scraps of cloth. No one was too small. No one was turned away. At one point, a sudden gust of wind blew out 2 of the candles near the doorway. A young soldier, barely older than a boy himself, quickly relit them with a match, shielding the flame with his cupped hands. As he did, a little girl nearby watched him, then shyly offered him a piece of bread from her pocket. He took it with a quiet "thank you," and for a moment, the line between soldier and stranger blurred into something softer. The cobbler glanced up and saw it, the way people leaned toward each other, not away. The way hands brushed as tools were passed. The way someone always made room when another needed to sit. This wasn't just about shoes anymore. It was about presence. About showing up for people you'd never meet simply because they were hurting. Hours passed. The moon climbed higher. The fire burned low, then was fed again. Still no one left. It was as if they all understood. This night mattered. Not because of what they were making, but because of what they were becoming. Sometime after midnight, the cobbler stood to stretch his back. His knees cracked and his fingers felt stiff, but he didn't mind. He walked to the doorway and looked out at the square. Lanterns glowed in clusters. Voices murmured like distant waves. A cat curled up near the fire, belly full from scraps. And there, near the edge of the crowd, sat his son, finally asleep, slumped against a sack of leather. Boots lined neatly at his feet like silent guards. The father stood there for a long time, watching him breathe. He remembered the boy who used to climb trees and come home with scraped knees, who once cried for a week when his pet chicken wandered off. That boy was still in there, somewhere beneath the uniform and the tired eyes, but he'd also become something else, someone who carried the weight of others without complaint, who risked his standing to bring help where it was needed most. In that moment, the cobbler realized his son hadn't just brought a request to the village. He'd brought a mirror, a reflection of what they all could be, when fear gave way to kindness, when distance gave way to care. He walked back inside and picked up a pair of small boots, scuffed, slightly damp, clearly worn by a child who'd walked too far in them. He began to polish them slowly, carefully, the way he always did. But this time it wasn't just for his own peace. It was for the child who would wear them next, for the mother who would tie the laces, for the hope that warm feet might mean one less worry in a life already heavy with them. Around him the work continued. A woman stitched a tear in a wool sock, her needle flashing in the candlelight. A boy tested the fit of a repaired sandal on his own foot, then nodded in satisfaction. An old man told a quiet story about the winter of '78, when snow buried the roads for weeks and neighbors shared everything: bread, firewood, even beds. No one interrupted. They just listened, hands never still. There was no grand speech that night, no ceremony, just people doing what they could as best they could, for as long as it took. And in that simplicity something powerful grew, not loud, not flashy, but deep, like roots spreading under the soil, unseen but holding everything together. As dawn began to whisper at the edges of the sky, the last few pairs were finished. The parcels were stacked in neat rows near the convoy trucks, each one labeled with size and type in careful handwriting. The soldiers moved quietly, loading them with reverence as if carrying something sacred. The sun woke just before sunrise. He rubbed his face, looked at the boots at his feet, and smiled faintly. Then he stood, brushed the dust from his uniform, and walked to his father. They didn't hug. They didn't need to. They just stood side by side, watching the first light spill over the hills, painting the village in soft gold. "You changed something," the father said quietly. His son shook his head. "We all did," and in that quiet truth, the night ended, not with fanfare but with a shared breath, a nod, and the understanding that sometimes the smallest acts, polishing a boot, stitching a tear, offering a sock, can echo farther than anyone ever expects. The convoy left just as the sun cleared the eastern ridge, its trucks rumbling to life one by one, engines coughing softly in the cool morning air. There were no speeches, no waving flags, no fanfare, just a quiet nod from the young soldier to his father, a quick handshake with the village elder, and then the slow roll of tires on packed earth. Dust rose behind them, swirling in the golden light, then settled again as the road emptied. The villagers stood in the square for a long while after the last truck disappeared over the hill. No one spoke. No one moved. It wasn't sadness they felt. It was something quieter, deeper. Like the hush that follows a prayer. They had given what they could, not knowing if it would be enough, not knowing if it would even reach the people it was meant for. But they had given it anyway. And in that giving, something inside them had shifted. Life returned to its usual rhythm, but not quite the same. The cobbler reopened his shop the next day as always. He swept the floor, boiled tea, and set out his tools. But now, when neighbors passed by, they paused a little longer. They asked how he was, not just about the weather or the price of flour, but really asked. And he answered, not with the short fine he used to offer, but with something closer to truth. Days turned into weeks. The village settled back into its routines. Goats were herded, bread was baked, children ran through the alleys shouting games only they understood. But something lingered in the air, a softness, a quiet awareness that they were part of something larger than their own walls and worries. Then, one afternoon, a letter arrived. It wasn't official. No government stamp, no military seal. Just a plain envelope, slightly crumpled, addressed in careful, uneven handwriting to the people of the village near the Blue Hill. The postman didn't know who it was for, so he left it at the mosque, where the imam read it aloud after evening prayers. It was from a woman in the camp. She wrote that the boots had come just as the first frost settled, that her daughter, who hadn't walked in days because her feet were too sore, put on a pair of small polished boots and danced in the snow. She said the socks were so warm they felt like hugs, and she thanked them, not by name but as a whole, for remembering people they'd never seen. More letters came after that. Not every day, not even every week, but enough to keep the memory alive. One was from a boy who said his new shoes made him feel like a soldier too, strong, ready. Another came with a pressed flower tucked inside and a note that simply read, "Thank you for seeing us." The cobbler kept each one in a wooden box on his shelf, next to his tins of polish. He didn't show them off, but sometimes late at night he'd take one out and read it again, his fingers tracing the words like they were threads he could follow back to that night of quiet giving. One letter stood out more than the others. It was written in a child's hand, letters slightly crooked, ink smudged in places, but full of pride. "The boots kept my feet warm," it said. "My brother says your town must be made of kindness." When the cobbler read those words, he sat very still. Then he folded the letter carefully, placed it back in the box, and walked to his workbench. He didn't have a customer waiting. He didn't have an order to fill. But he picked up a pair of small boots, scuffed, worn, clearly second-hand, and began to polish them. He worked slowly, the way he always did. Circular motions on the toe, extra care on the stitching. He tied the laces in a double knot, no loops. When he was done, he placed them on the shelf with the others, not because someone had asked for them, but because someone somewhere might need them. Word spread quietly through the village that the cobbler was accepting donations again, not just shoes, but anything that could help. Socks, scarves, even small toys. People brought what they could. A woman gave a pair of mittens she'd knitted for her own child but never used. A farmer donated a sack of wool scraps for padding. No one made a show of it. They just left things at the shop door, often with no note, no name. The cobbler never asked where the items came from. He just repaired them, cleaned them, made them ready. And every few weeks, when a passing aid vehicle stopped for water or rest, he'd offer a bundle, neatly wrapped, never mentioned unless asked. His son didn't return for many months. When he finally did, it was on leave, his uniform cleaner but his eyes still carrying that quiet depth. He didn't come with a convoy this time, just a small bag and a tired smile. He found his father in the shop polishing another pair of boots, these ones tiny, clearly meant for a toddler. They didn't talk about the camp. They didn't need to. They sat together in comfortable silence, the only sound the soft rub of cloth on leather. After a while, the son reached into his bag and pulled out a photograph. It showed a group of children standing in the snow, all wearing mismatched coats and boots, but smiling. One little girl held up her foot, showing off a pair that looked familiar. The cobbler studied the photo for a long time. Then he handed it back without a word. But his son saw it, the slight softening around his eyes, the way his shoulders relaxed just a little. That evening, they walked to the edge of town and watched the sunset, just like they used to when the boy was small. The sky burned orange and pink, painting the hills in fire and gold. Neither spoke. They didn't have to. Back in the village, life went on. But something had changed, not in the streets or the buildings, but in the way people looked at each other. There was more patience in their voices, more space in their silences. They had learned that kindness doesn't need a reason. It just needs hands willing to work and hearts willing to care. And in a small shop near the square, a man still polished boots late into the night, not because he was weighty,